Hey there, if you don't know me, my name is Maria and I love talking about tech. And today I'm going to be talking about a book that I read that's actually about tech and in Silicon Valley. I thought it would be really interesting to talk about what I've learned from this story and the crazy things that can go down in Silicon Valley because of the VC bubble, how startups operate, and the power that a CEO has over the company and how that like trickles down into the company's culture and all the problems that can ensue from this. So if you're not familiar with what this book is about, it's called Bad Blood and it was written by investigative journalist John Carreyrou. And what this story follows is the rise and fall of the multi-billion-dollar biotech company Theranos. Theranos was actually being run by a college dropout from Stanford named Elizabeth Holmes, and her goal was to revolutionize the medical industry by creating a technology that would make blood testing easier and cheaper. She was even backed by a bunch of really famous VCs, and then the company was valued at over $9 billion. But the one problem was the technology didn't work. And I even watched the documentary that HBO made about it. And it was so cool because you actually get to see the inside of the buildings and who the people actually look like. I thought it was really interesting that they included views from a behavioral psychologist to actually analyze why Elizabeth was like this. So why did the CEO continuously lie? I was interested by one of the things he said, which was that we actually need to look at the journey of Elizabeth, not just her end, because she did in the beginning have positive intentions. So essentially, Elizabeth was growing up in a family where her father was very much a person who valued reputation. He tried drilling this mentality into Elizabeth from a very young age. When people would ask her what does she want to be when she grows up, she would say she would want to be a billionaire. So while Elizabeth did go to high school in Houston, she wanted to go to Silicon Valley really badly. So her dream school for college was Stanford. She started studying Mandarin in high school, and there was actually a camp being held at Stanford for people who speak Mandarin, who are in like high school, I suppose. That was like her first foot in the door to getting into Stanford and getting into like Silicon Valley and the world there. After she graduated high school, she did attend Stanford, and that was for chemical engineering. However, she only stayed for 1 year until she dropped out. And the reason was because the summer after her first year of university, she actually traveled to Singapore to help out with treating people who had SARS, because this was like in the early 2000s, like 2001 or 2. And she realized that there was a problem with how people were like drawing blood. She decided that she was going to actually make this patent for a medical device that would administer drugs to patients through like a patch. And she decided to show it to some of her professors at Stanford. An actual like well-known medical professor said, "This is not going to work. What you're telling me is not actually feasibly possible. It is science fiction." Whereas this other guy, who she was actually a researcher for, she told this one professor and his PhD student about it, and they thought it was a great idea because they just like believed in her so much. Thing with Elizabeth that you have to understand is that if you listen to her speeches, like she is one of those people who can give good TED Talks, you know? Like she is one of those people who exudes confidence and that she is a very believable person. So what she decided to do after that was to actually create her own company. So she dropped out of school and she made the company called Theranos, which is a combination of two words, therapy and diagnosis. Her plan was to create this patch called the TheraPatch. She went to all these medical VCs and had meetings with them because she had a bunch of family connections. These medical VCs would ask her good questions, and if she couldn't answer them, she would just walk out of the meetings. So essentially, Elizabeth decided that, okay, if I can't create this patch, then what can I do? So she looked at diabetics and how they have their blood tested, and it's through taking like a prick. So she's like, okay, we can actually do something like this, but I want the smallest possible amount of blood. So she decided to do some finger prick technology where you would prick your finger and then the container would hold your blood and then you would put it into a machine and test it. So the story of actually creating this device that Theranos wanted to manufacture starts in 2006 when Elizabeth hired the fix-it man called Edmund Koo. And when she interviewed him, she sold the story of how Theranos could help the world, because what she wanted to do with this system was actually test people's blood a lot. And she was saying like, oh yes, the Theranos system could be like not just a snapshot of your blood test, like, oh, you take a blood test every year or something. It could be like a movie where you take the blood test every month and it can show you the changes in your blood, and you can see all of that yourself instead of having to go to the doctor all the time, because she wanted these devices to be in people's homes. So it's a good idea in theory because it allows people to be, more in charge of their health. So essentially, when Elizabeth hired Edmund Koo, his job was to create the entire system, or like fix it, because they had been trying to create this, but then it wasn't successful. Another huge problem about working in Theranos was that Elizabeth wanted everyone to just communicate up to her, and she did not let the biochemistry team communicate with the engineering team, which is a horrible idea because you both need each other to create this product. Edmund was really surprised about the high turnover rate of this brand new company. So in fact, he says that top executives didn't even last long either. Chief financial officer had just randomly disappeared one day. His departure, like all others, wasn't announced or explained. And it basically made for a very unnerving work environment. She started hiring new engineers, and she didn't have them report to him. So she essentially started building a rival engineering team that was going against his, but that wasn't the main thing that Ed had to deal with, because Elizabeth had made a contract with Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company. She had convinced them to try out the Theranos 1.0 system on cancer patients, like terminal cancer patients. She had this whole idea that they would fix all of their problems with the system before this would happen. Ed was so surprised that she would do this because he thought that it was very premature, because the system doesn't even work. Why are you making all these business deals when the actual medical device does not work and it has not been approved by anyone yet? The competition between the two engineering teams actually intensified because the leader of the new engineering team had this brilliant new idea of using this robotic arm to actually hold a pipette, and then that would be actually used to distribute it into the different solutions. He asked her, what would you like this to be called? And she said, we tried everything else and it failed, so let's call it the Edison. And that's pretty funny because if you don't know the story of Thomas Edison, then I guess you think it's oh, it's cute, he's her role model. Well, actually, I guess he was a pretty bad role model because not only was he a well-known inventor, but he was very good at deceiving people, because what he liked to do is to lie to the people also investing into his projects, because he wouldn't have them ready or working, including his incandescent light bulb. I really liked it in the HBO documentary how they described that Thomas Edison's best invention was himself, because he acted like he could conjure anything in his laboratory. He often promised way more than he could deliver, and then that's very clearly seen in how Elizabeth acted with Theranos. But Thomas Edison was not Elizabeth's only role model. Her biggest role model was by far Steve Jobs. And she was so envious of Apple and what he had been able to create that she wanted to become just like him. But really, nobody wants to follow a copycat. So she started trying to poach people from Apple to work for her. What happened was that she would actually start dressing like Steve Jobs as well. She would wear a black turtleneck all the time. However, it wasn't long before the Apple transplants, as they called them, started noticing the interesting quirks of working at Theranos. The worst part about working at Theranos was the security, because Elizabeth was super paranoid about security. The two people who ran IT, they set up the computer networks so that different people were siloed into different sections where they couldn't even communicate with each other. And there was also a part in the book where they were talking about how these 3 employees used to commute together. They would work in different departments. So one day they were talking about work, and one of them, who was working in the lab, mentioned to the other that he was really worried because he knew that Theranos was using imperfect blood testing on cancer patients. And when one of the other employees heard this, she was like, what? How can they do that? She didn't know about that. She thought that the blood system was perfected. So that just shows that the company had no actual communication to its employees. And another problem was that Elizabeth was very much vastly inflating the revenue forecasts that she was projecting to prospective companies and even to her investors. Actually, someone went to the board and told them about this information, and they decided that they should actually get Elizabeth to not be the CEO anymore. What happened was they brought her in for a meeting to tell her this information, and what she did was she spent 2 hours convincing them about how she will change and become the best CEO they've ever seen, and they believed her. After that happened, she decided to fire the people who told the board about the problem. And also I wanted to include this because when one of the people resigned, they sent Elizabeth this letter, and it said, "Good luck, and please do read those books that he gave her about becoming a good manager." He said, "Watch The Office and believe in the people who disagree with you. Lying is a disgusting habit and it flows through the conversations here like it's our own currency. The cultural disease here is what we should be curing before we try to tackle obesity." Also, I don't know if I want to get into this because it's just crazy, but Elizabeth had this random childhood neighbor and she was like family friends with him and his family. The father was apparently mad at her because she knew that he had a bunch of patents, and when she was creating his patent, she didn't come to him for advice. So he decided that he was going to create he researched what she was doing, and he was like, "Oh, she's gonna need this to be patented in the future, like this one thing. So I'm going to patent it right now." And she found out about it, and then there was this like whole lawsuit fiasco, which we'll get into later. In addition, Elizabeth decided to hire her boyfriend at the time, who they called Sonny. He made like a bunch of money in like the dot-com boom when he like joined this company and they just got acquired. He came in as the vice executive chairman, and that's actually nepotism. You're not supposed to have people that you have a relationship with as a higher up in your company, but they didn't care about that, I guess, because they were a private company, and private companies can do whatever they want. A good description of him was from one of the employees named Chelsea, and she said he spawned a culture of fear with his intimidating behavior. Firings had always been a common occurrence at the company, but in late 2009 and early 2010, it was Sonny who took the role of Hatchet Man. Okay, now the next phase in Theranos' crazy journey begins. We started off with seeing that there is this man that's called Dr. J, who is a real doctor, but he's been working mostly in the corporate world. And right now, he is currently working for Walgreens, this drugstore chain in America. What he does is he was working on the innovation team, and he was supposed to look for new ideas and new technologies to reboot Walgreens. Elizabeth and Sonny were invited to fly over to Philadelphia, where the Walgreens headquarters was, to meet with Dr. J and some of the other executives. Once Dr. J met them, he was so enamored by this idea because he's a health nut himself, and he believed that this would help make people's lives easier and help them become more interested in their own health. Alright, so moving into the next phase of Theranos devices is actually the mini lab. What happens is that with Safeway and Walgreens on board as retail partners, Elizabeth suddenly had to face the problem of her lies, because she told both companies that her technology would work for possibly hundreds of different blood tests, when in reality it only worked for one specific type, which is called immunoassays. So those can test things like vitamin D or to detect prostate cancer. But for other routine blood tests, the Theranos devices could not handle that. So essentially what they built is like a shrunken lab. That's why it's called mini lab, because they essentially just took all the ways that lab technicians actually do their work and they just put it in a miniaturized form. Another problem was that Elizabeth and Sonny were either unable or maybe unwilling to understand the difference between a prototype and an actually finished product. The prototype needs to actually be finely tuned and tested before it can go to market. Technically, most companies, they do 3 prototypes. Sonny was already ordering all of these components for making 100 mini labs on an untested first prototype, which is crazy. It's not, especially something that's in the medical field, it would need to be tested by the FDA in America to be used. And they weren't even thinking about that. Okay, and now we're back to the part where Elizabeth's neighbor, she's actually filing a lawsuit against him and his son. And because of this lawsuit, we get to this really sad part of the story, which was how there was this very renowned chemist who worked at Theranos, and he was an old man already, so like in his 60s when he joined the company. He had an office and everything, but then Elizabeth started like fighting with him, or like he started questioning things, and she decided to move him down in the ranks, and he was like in a corner, not supposed to talk to anybody. And he actually suffered from undiagnosed clinical depression for over 2 years. Because of this case, people who were being sued by Elizabeth, like the neighbor and his son, they saw that on the patents that Elizabeth had filed, this man's name, Ian Gibbons, his name was always on all of those patents. They decided, okay, we can call him in for questioning about the patent. Theranos told him that he was going to be on the stand and have to answer all these questions, and he felt so stressed about this that the day before the trial, he actually committed suicide. And it's horrible because of the way that the company treated him, especially Elizabeth, and how even after all that happened, in the documentary, you see his wife talking. They asked her the question, did you ever hear from Theranos after that? And she said, no. All they did was ask me to send back his company equipment and all his paperwork, and that's it. No apologies, nothing, like no repercussions for all the actions that they did to end this man's life, which is absolutely horrendous. Eventually, Elizabeth decided that it's time to launch with Walgreens. They decided that they would hire this famous ad company. So they created like this whole commercial for Theranos, and then Elizabeth also tried to make like the ads misleading and like we're lying about information even though they don't have actual proof to back up the statements that they're saying, like how they're more like superior to actual clinical labs. And it's actually illegal to lie. You can't just say those things on like in commercials. So after 2.5 years of the mini lab being under construction, it still didn't work. The main problem was, of course, the dysfunctional company culture. Also, another problem was that she wanted this device to be capable of performing 4 major classes of blood tests. And then the only way to do this was to get the robot that's inside of the mini lab to operate pipettes. And the problem was over time, those pipettes lose accuracy and you have to actually switch them out manually. Elizabeth didn't want to lose this deal with Walgreens because it was like basically the only thing they had on the table at that point. And they had to finish by September, which is like a few months away. She basically had these 2 engineers jailbreak another blood tester company's machine. What they did is that they would use that machine, and then they would just, like, that machine required a larger quantity of blood than what they were asking people for, right? So then what they would do is they would dilute the blood. You're not supposed to do that because even in the specifications, you have to have that much blood or else you're not going to get accurate results. Finally, in 2013, they opened the first Walgreens wellness centers in Phoenix because there were many uninsured patients there. What they would do is that they would send the test back to Palo Alto. They would be tested there. But the problem was, of course, the temperature, because you're transferring those from the truck and it's very hot. That definitely affected the blood results, especially for potassium. They were also, during this time, breaking lab testing laws, and they were actually sending the results calculated from other blood analyzers. A Fortune writer decided to do a cover story on Elizabeth. Then she basically became famous overnight from this article, and then she started doing so many interviews like every single day, and she did the famous TED Med presentation, and eventually some people started to actually form a group of skeptics. So there was this guy named Alan Beam, and he resigned as the lab director at Theranos, and the guy who's actually Elizabeth's neighbor who got sued, and then some blogger and the doctor, they went to this investigative journalist, the one who wrote this book, because they feared themselves getting sued. I also like how he put it that they were trying, it's like you're trying to build a bus when someone is actually already driving the bus, so someone is going to get killed. Well, especially when you're working in a biotech, because if you do the lab test and you return them and they're wrong, there will be 2 results. Either one, people are going to get tested abnormally high and they're going to spend a lot of money, especially in America where there's no free healthcare. They're going to spend a lot of money, so there's going to be a huge emotional and financial toll on these people. The second case is where people get lower results or normal results when they shouldn't be, and then that could lead to death because what if they didn't detect cancer? Okay, now we're nearing the end. So the Wall Street Journal, John Carreyrou, they decided that they were going to run this like really big investigative piece on Theranos, and it was going to be featured on the front page. So Elizabeth knew that they were going to do this, and she decided to actually go to the owner of the company that owns the Wall Street Journal. She went to that guy and she tried getting him to invest in Theranos so that he would try to stop the Wall Street Journal from publishing anything. What happened was the Wall Street Journal obviously published the article and it was on the front page, and it was a huge scandal. They published a second article following up. It was like another piece about how the FDA actually cracked down on the Theranos lab finally, and also how Walgreens decided to stop opening more wellness centers. In addition, the CMS did a surprise lab investigation, and they concluded that there were major problems that were unsafe for patients in the Theranos lab. They gave Theranos 10 days to fix those things, which were like 45 different things. Theranos actually failed to correct 43 out of the 45 deficiencies that the inspectors found, the inspectors threatened to ban Theranos from the blood testing business for 2 years. Walgreens eventually terminated their whole thing with Theranos, and they shut down all the wellness centers back in 2016. The CMS followed through on banning Elizabeth and Theranos in July of 2016, and Theranos was now subject to a criminal investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco and a civil probe by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So in 2018, Theranos was officially dissolved, and Elizabeth and Sonny were charged with conspiracy and fraud. And I got really into this, and I actually watched some video on YouTube of like reporters who actually found out that Elizabeth is living somewhere in America. Now she's this like new boyfriend or fiance actually. They even have a husky, and I'm so jealous. Like the interviewer is asking her like, oh, how do you feel? You were a role model for young girls, and you did all of this stuff. And how do you feel about all the people's money and people's health that might have been affected because of you? And she would just not answer. She was just walking by, and I'm like, wow, what a great person. So essentially why I wanted to talk about this book was I found it really interesting, and it gave me some sort of insight kind of to how things work in Silicon Valley, a little bit of the mindset and somewhat of things that can go wrong in a company where you're not actually paying attention to things, and when you drink the Kool-Aid, you know, the saying. So I think it's actually a benefit to be a skeptic sometimes, and especially to try and make sure that you are entering or you are working at a company that you believe in, especially if it's a startup. It's very important for you to be very careful of which companies you join and for like what reasons you want to be there. So we can continue the discussion in the comments below. Tell me what you thought of this story, and thanks for watching.